Il prossimo relatore è Emanuele Tomassini. L'attuale crisi economica internazionale è ancora più evidente in Europa. Emanuele Tomassini ci parlerà di come siamo giunti a questo punto e di come questa crisi sia stata manipolata.
And how the crisis was manipulated against the interest of Europe's citizens. He will be talking to us about what is happening in Italy by way of example, and sharing with us the concept that the only way to resolve the crisis is not within politics, finance, or in merely human solutions. Rather, it lies in the message of the Madonna of Fatima. It is a pleasure for me, therefore, to introduce you to Emanuele Tomassini. You have the floor. Good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to begin my speech by illustrating the basic theory I have for my argument, so that we can then proceed to explore my logic. I want to start by specifying that I'm not an economist, but a journalist. So I will be addressing the economic and social crisis with particular focus on Europe, and will take this as my starting point to then develop issues connected to the creation of interest, currency, and how this is all connected to my argument. There is a plan to establish a world government, and this in turn requires a new religion, because without a new faith it will not be possible to establish any form of new dictatorship. In order to achieve a form of world government, it's necessary to remove from mankind's minds their very sense of individualism, their loyalty to family traditions, their sense of national belonging and any true religious faith. Also, as I will explain, it's necessary to do so to take control of the very notion of Europe. Behind any economic explanation, there lies political motivation. Behind each political notion, in turn, there is a philosophical reference framework and indeed a metaphysical framework. Metaphysics are the very foundations of the structures on which the economy effectively constitutes a roof. It's unthinkable to imagine that the economy could stand alone from politics. Neither can politics be separate from moral, and neither can we think of the independence of politics and morality from metaphysics, and as a result from the sacred. Once upon a time, Christianity brought together Europe through a single faith and a united vision of the world. The different cultures of European nations, both to the east and the west, shared a single lifeblood drawn from a single source. To paraphrase the words of St. Pius XII in his famous apostolic letter Notre Charge Apostolique, and that of Leon XIII in his equally famous encyclical letter Immortale Dei, we could say that Europe does not need to be invented. Rather, it has existed and exists to date. Christian civilization that was once united in its differences, in the difference of nations and the diversity of its customs and traditions, was united by a single life philosophy, that of the gospel. Europe, as John Paul II confirmed, is Christian in its very roots. Europe exists because Christian civilization exists. The end of Europe, in the sense when we think of a Christian end, began with the French Revolution, which was indeed masterminded and fueled by the Freemasons, whose main goal was to annihilate the Christian civilization and lead to the birth of a new European and world order. As Father Kramer explained only too well in his book, The Mystery of Iniquity, already back in 1730, in a book published in Brussels entitled The Secret of Freemasonry, we can find these fundamental beliefs and the planned notions of this sect. Their end goal is to create a world republic. In 1737, a spokesman for the Grand Lodge of France declared that the goal of the Freemasons was to create a spiritual notion, and take note of that reference to a spiritual nation made up of all the world's citizens, given that the world is a great republic in which each nation is a family and therefore each inhabitant is a son. So for the past 2 centuries now, we've been witnessing an open clash between a religion, the Masonic religion inherited from mystic and Gnostic cults of pre-Christian civilization, and the Catholic Christian civilization. It was indeed the growth of the Freemason culture, which in the economy too disrupted systems that for centuries had upheld the way of life of peoples. Indeed, to be specific, these forces were using and continue to use the economy itself to impose their new vision of the world. Right back from the 1700s onwards, and particularly in the 1800s, the period which marked the increasing power, particularly in political terms, of these forces, central banks started to issue paper money. Rather, they started to print banknotes for a total that exceeded the coverage capacity of the banknotes themselves. Such procedures were fundamentally encouraged by 2 aspects. Firstly, the fact that in reality the funds available and circulating in trade relations already was constituted by banknotes, which effectively were represented in conversions to gold by those who owned the banknotes themselves. This was becoming increasingly rare. From another standpoint, so the second point, the ability to obtain heightened profits through interest and loans carried out in the banknotes was also a consideration. It's this very search for profit, the interest that is obtained from lending money, that has led the world to the very brink of an irreversible economic crisis. In the Middle Ages, money lending against interest was banned by, and supported indeed by, many Christian theologians. In the centuries which followed, however, the Western Christian world slowly managed to make credit lending activities legitimate and reinterpreted the Holy Scriptures in a less binding fashion. Already in the 13th century, within the Catholic Church, a vast debate was underway on the legitimacy of granting loans on interest. Well before the Protestant Revolution, the Catholic world was starting to make a distinction between loans and usury. It accepted the use of the former as long as the end goal was a productive one. The birth of the first banks in Italy and Spain dates back to this period. They would be able to fill up their coffers by lending the money that they in turn received. Let me remind you that all monotheistic religions, in their origins, banned not only usury but also lending with interest. And let me remind you that in the Gospel it's written, you may give but do not expect anything in return. Your recompense will be great. According to the French historian Jacques Le Goff, the use of money in medieval times needs to be taken on board within the so-called concept of the economy of gift. The subordination of human activities to the grace of God also involves money. He also adds that it is the use of money by the lay faithful which was conditioned by 2 specifically medieval conceptions, namely the aspiration to justice, that then develops into this theory of the right price, and the spiritual presence of the notion of caritas. In the Middle Ages, charity was more important, therefore, than any market considerations. With the advent of the industrial age, it was important to provide enough money to meet the requirements of a strongly growing economy. As a result, in 1870, the so-called commercial banks were born. They were open to the public. They were organized in joint stock companies that would take on savings from the public and would lend money through bank accounts and banknotes. Gold gradually became a reserve, moving outside the trade considerations to then move into central banks' coffers. Slowly, therefore, what would advance was the notion according to which authorities, monetary authorities, could emit funds equal to a maximum value equivalent to the gold held. Such a system, known as the gold standard, was adopted by an international conference in 1867 by all main Western economies. At the same time, so in the same historic period, in 1893, the roots of 20th century ecumenism were laid. That period saw a growing interest in the creation of greater unity with a supposed goal of creating a earthly utopia. Organizations of a Masonic bent, going from the Golden Dawn to the Theosophic Society, were very active in laying these foundations for the future century in which they hoped to finally welcome the much-awaited, eagerly awaited New World Order. In such a context, religious leaders from all over the world met in Chicago for an ecumenic event of historic proportions, namely the Parliament of Religions of the World, which took place in 1893. As the years passed, and following this logical thread that allows us to understand how, in all likelihood, the monetary crises that followed one another were, in fact, simply planned events with a view to bringing peoples to their knees and making them follow the forces that governed those processes. We then reached the key moment represented by the 1929 financial crisis that meant the end to the gold standard and the monetary clusters that had been created. The solution that was envisaged during the Bretton Woods conference that took place in 1944, and let us not forget that this also led to the creation, or was connected to the creation of the United Nations, was to provide for funding by countries in surplus, first and foremost the US, towards countries in deficit. In 1944, Bretton Woods saw the birth of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, as well as the creation of these supranational organisms born with a view to helping and indeed stifling in some cases countries in difficulty, and in the interest of the wealthier countries, there equally began a metaphysical notion of a new world order. Robert Muller, assistant to the General Secretariat of the United Nations, introduced religions to a greater representation within the UN, especially when it came to new faiths. This also embraced all concepts connected to a world government, a world peace, and a world spirituality. Muller is also known as the philosopher or the prophet of hope of the UN. He established a school system called the Robert Muller School. It specifies explicitly in his manual that the explicit philosophy on which this school is based can be found in the overall teachings of Alice A. Bailey. But who is Alice Bailey? Alice Bailey was a follower of Madame Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophic Society, and at Blavatsky's death, Bailey took on the leadership of this group. Theosophy is effectively a syncretic cult, neo-gnostically and essentially satanic Lucifer in nature. It's nothing new. It's effectively age-old heresy that has been shifted into our modern times. If it was just the case of a sect, clearly it would not be worth us dwelling on it. But the problem is that Theosophy has had great success and, far from having disappeared, has led to the establishment of New Age pseudo-mysticism that has a lot of sway within the United Nations. Alice Bailey is indeed considered to have inspired the training program adopted by UNESCO, which purports to educate the world. Let us also not forget that Bailey claims to have written many of her books while possessed by the entity of a bodily master. That's just one example of what the master of Alice Bailey said. The New World Order needs to be appropriated to us. It's a world that has passed through a destructive crisis and a type of humanity that has been traumatized by the experience. The current world order must therefore need to be modified and changed so that a new order of men, a new race, can gradually come to light.
La società da lei fondata, la Lucis Trust, ex Lucifer Trust, è tra le più rispettate organizzazioni non governative dell'ONU. La sua grande invocazione, una formula mistica per
non-governmental organizations in the UN. Its grand invocation was translated into as many as 50 languages. It received great attention on the part of the world dignitaries at the UN, where it was listened to at many official conferences and at opening ceremonies of the Rio Summit in 1992. In 1948, the World Council of Churches of the United Nations was established. Its purpose was clear. It was that of creating a religious atmosphere in order to achieve a new world order. But back to economics. The gold reserves of individual central banks lose the primary role that they had played up until then and make room for the dollar as the basic currency of the international monetary system. Therefore, the central bank reserves reserves will consist primarily of currency reserves, primarily in dollars, as well as foreign government bonds. And the Bretton Woods system also does not withstand the trials of a market and of an economy that become increasingly complex. The end of the possibility of converting dollars into gold is decreed by the U.S. President Nixon when it appears clear that the system is much too burdensome for the United States. So in 1971, a shift was made to a system based on flexible exchange rates. Deficits no longer generated flows in gold or other goods in favor of surplus countries, but rather brought about devaluations of currencies. The monetary authorities can therefore issue money, hard money, in the amounts wished by as they wish, and no longer on the basis of the amount of gold or other precious metal that they hold in their coffers, so that at this point the expression legal tender comes to replace the notion of goods currency. The intrinsic value of a currency consists in the value of the instrument that is used as a currency. It depends on the value of the good that makes up that given currency. For example, a paper money or a 10-euro bill has a value that's an intrinsic value equivalent to the cost required in order to produce it. Likewise, a metal coin, say a 1-euro coin, has an intrinsic value equivalent to the cost of coining it. So the gradual shift in the use of coin, of precious metal currencies into non-material currencies knocked down the intrinsic value of hard currency and consequently also the cost to produce it. So the currency is not issued against gold reserves held in a central bank. Therefore, the circulation of currency consists in recognizing its face value, which depends only and exclusively on the trust in the fact that those who receive payment in a certain amount of money can give back the equivalent in terms of goods and services. So this fiduciary mechanism guarantees that the nominal, or rather face value, is also the actual value of the currency. But the fiduciary mechanism is integrated by the legal obligation to accept a payment in the legal tender of one's country, or by rules and regulations enshrined in the civil code, whereby once the payment is made, the obligation is extinguished, so that the debtor is freed once and for all. So in a nutshell, paper money that is currently used and that are completely freed from the amounts of precious metals available have a value as a stable payment means recognized in the economy of a given country. Now, the ongoing dematerialization of currency is bringing this about. The control of hard money on the part of banks and large financial facilities, or as stated by Henry Kissinger, the 56th Secretary of State of the United States, during the Richard Nixon administration and the administration also of Gerald Ford, stated that those who control money control the world. Or Rothschild actually said, give me control over the offer of currency of a country, and I will no longer have to worry about who provides its legislation. So this quickly takes us over to today's, to current times, and to the terrible financial crisis of 2008. The motivations underpinning this financial and economic crisis are to be sought, as we've seen, basically in the past. As the former Italian Ministry for the Economy, Mr. Giulio Tremonti, stated in a recent book, Uscite di Sicurezza, Safety Exit, well, he refers exactly, or points it to, an extraordinary process of concentration and degeneration of social structures, mental, juridical, and economic, as a result of which money is concentrated in the hands of few. The problem to be solved, and I'm referring to Europe, is that in the wake of the crisis generated by these supranational powers and by super banks, it is precisely the very same financial powers that have handed over power to states so as to establish a single world order. It is possible, or is it possible to come out of this impasse? It's unlikely that this will be possible only through human beings. Many political and scholars and economists agree that there is no solution to this problem, and that a world war could break out in the very near future. Hence, an appeal to all Catholics and non-Catholics to focus attention on the message of Our Lady of Fatima. In actual fact, we are faced with we're facing an inevitable shift, and there are two ways to go. Either we proceed towards the annihilation of nations, or we work towards promoting the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary and peace in the world. Only a metaphysical intervention, in actual fact, can really counter a destructive will that is before everyone's eyes. I should like to conclude with a message of hope and with a concrete action which we're carrying forward with the help of God. Next to me is a European flag. You might not be aware of the fact that the 12 stars don't represent the 12 European states. For when the European Union was established, it was comprised of 7 states. According to the Brussels bureaucrats, the meaning would be the following. The 12 stars in a circle are a symbol of the ideals of unity, solidarity, and harmony amongst European peoples. But the choice of this design or this flag has a much longer history. The winning design was produced by French designer Arsène Heides, who provided a biblical explanation to his design. And indeed, he referred to an image of the devotion to Our Lady, which refers to the 12th chapter of Revelation. A great sign appeared in the sky, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Vittorio Messori then described the birth of, or the origin of Heids's inspiration. In May 1949, in Strasbourg, the Council of Europe was established. At the time, this body didn't have actual political powers. It was simply in charge of laying the groundwork on which to build a European federation. The following year, 1950, the Council launched a competition of ideas open to all artists in order to come up with a design for the future flag of United Europe. A young designer from Alsace by the name of Arsène Heides participated producing a design featuring 12 stars arranged in a circle set against a blue background. And this was not perchance. He was very devoted to Our Lady, and he prayed the rosary every day. And when he heard about the European competition, he was reading, actually, the story or the biography of the saint, Catherine Labouré, and stimulated by that reading, he had decided to find for himself and for his wife the famous miraculous medal, which, lo and behold, features the 12 stars arranged in a circle. So those 12 stars have come precisely from this inspiration and from the revelation, this woman clothed in the sun and with a crown of 12 stars on her head. So Europe, you see, wasn't simply something that was invented in 1991 in Maastricht. Quite the contrary, it goes much farther back in time. And it is precisely here that I should like to announce that in the month of September, we shall gather together in Strasbourg, the seat of the European Parliament, but also the seat of the Cathedral of Our Lady, some European MPs of Catholic inspiration to meet with Father Father Gruner and other representatives from the Fatima Center in order to reassert the concept and the need to restore a Christian Europe, so as to underscore how urgent it is to focus on the message of Our Lady of Fatima and her revelations concerning not only world peace, but also the very serious financial crisis that looms over the world, and the question regarding the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Thank you ever so much for your kind attention.
Our Lady said to Sister Lucia of Fatima, "I promise to assist at the hour of death with all the graces necessary for salvation. All those who on the first Saturday of 5 consecutive months go to confession, receive Holy Communion, recite 5 decades of the Rosary, and keep me company for 15 minutes while meditating on the mysteries of the Rosary, with the intention of making reparation to me." Pray the Rosary every day to obtain peace for the world.